Duck houses, moats, and even Chris Huhne's trouser press. Of course we had to mention it, and chocolate hobnobs. All are etched on our political memories now. The expenses revelations may have been unwelcome to MPs, but they were the result of a piece of legislation MPs themselves voted for. Oh yes, the Freedom of Information Act. Well, for the latest in our Changemakers series, we spoke to the politician responsible for that act, David Clark.
Imagine this front door, May 97. A new Prime Minister's gone in promising more open government. A few months later, the man he tasked with that comes up with this, the white paper that would ultimately lead to the Freedom of Information Act. It was a bit more colourful than your average white paper, but then the man behind it was trying to make a point.
We'd had the secrecy of Mrs Thatcher. We'd had the dreariness of John Major, possibly. And there was a feeling that we were going to get a new government that was going to offer new excitements and new opportunities for its citizens. And the white paper on freedom of information was to be part of that process. And I felt it was now or never, because there was such a good feeling of goodwill towards the government, and we had to trade on that goodwill and to beat down the opposition.
And the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was a supporter.
I well recall sitting on the sofa with him on that day after the election, or was it 2 days after the election in '97, we were so full of hope, that the one big message he had for me was, get this freedom of information up and running, David. We need it, we want it, I want it.
So is he shocked that Tony Blair now sees that decision as naive?
I was a bit surprised to see his doubts in his book. And I wonder when he changed his mind. I think it might have been when he got more and more involved in international negotiations, perhaps over Iraq or Northern Ireland.
By the way, you should know I've accepted the presidency of the Campaign for Freedom of Information. What on earth for?
Getting the bill past sceptical civil servants of the likes parodied in political satires proved the toughest challenge.
What I was seeing when I had my cabinet committees was that there was a coordinated, coherent opposition to what I was trying to do. And it took me a little while before I worked out where this opposition was coming from. And really it came from the senior civil servants.
I need to know everything. How else can I judge whether or not I need to know it?
This was the way they'd done their business. They were comfortable with it. They were good at doing it in this way. And I was asking them to change. I was asking them to trust the politicians more. I was asking them to listen to the people more. And that's quite a big challenge when you spent 30 years doing your business in one particular way. I understood that.
And do you feel that you were pushed out of the job because you were being too radical?
I certainly think I made enemies because I was perhaps a bit too radical in what I was trying to push. But you know, I'd been in politics a long time. I had to work out a strategy. I knew what I needed to achieve, and therefore sometimes I had to be more radical, knowing that my colleagues might trim me back a little bit.
The law may have ended up being less radical than he'd hoped, but its impact was dramatic. After all, it was an FOI request that prompted the MP's expenses scandal.
I'm very sorry that it has caused so much damage to the parliamentary system. I'm sorry that it caused so much pain for so many people. But really, it wasn't the fault of the Freedom of Information Act. It actually was the fault of the system.
When you look back at it all, how do you think it worked?
I think the Freedom of Information Act is one of the best things I ever did in politics. I think I'm very privileged to have done that. I don't apologise for it for a moment. I think it will just enhance our system of democracy, and will go from strength to strength as more and more people use it.
Kevin Maguire and George Pascoe-Watson are still with me. Well, George Pascoe-Watson, Freedom of Information Bill, has it been a good thing?
It's been an enormous thing. It's had a gigantic effect on the British political scene. It's obviously been a good thing for people in the world of journalism and people who are sort of the democratic population of the country. It's been a very difficult thing for politicians and civil servants in Whitehall to navigate because it has meant that, you know, a lot of resource and time has been diverted into answering these sorts of questions. Because it does take
time, doesn't it?
It's also an expensive thing. You know, there is a cost every time. But it's a cost, I think, which is well worth paying, because it does keep politicians clean and honest.
Well, and I mean, in that film demonstrated incredible Tony Blair's, change of heart, saying how important it was we had to push this through. And then, actually, in my book, maybe I was a bit naive, he says.
If Tony Blair came back now and had his pledge card, he'd probably say, cut taxes on the rich, have fox hunting and no freedom of information. He's completely turned. But David Clarke gets a footnote in history because it has an enormous impact. George has mentioned keeps politicians clean. We saw everything around MPs and their pay and their moats and everything, and Chris Huhne's trouser press, which he grimaced.
Be delighted we mentioned that, yes.
But more importantly than that, you can now get the documents, see how policies are made. If there's a restaurant near you that's been inspected and failed a hygiene standard test, you can discover it. Why shouldn't you know what public officials are discovering? There was a terrible culture of secrecy which worked against the public.
But, I mean, George Pascoe Watson sort of raised that point. It does take up a lot of time, but also, has there got to be an element of some protection and secrecy of documents
definitely.
and things? Because otherwise, how do you run government?
No, of course. You can't have a carte blanche. You can't have the doors wide open to everything. There's a lot of security which goes on. There's an enormous battle against cybersecurity attacks on this country right now. All sorts of national security issues. And commercial issues often have to be kept, private and secret until deals are done for commercial reasons. We understand that. But in the main, it is a good thing that ministers are brought to account and have to explain their actions.
See, the culture is now, you're open, then you have to keep some things secret. Before, it was secret, and you might trust the people with a few bits of information. So it's completely changed how we look at government.
I don't suppose David Clarke ever anticipated it would rock Parliament in quite the way he
No,
thought.
I'm sure he didn't.